The mahogany-paneled study of the Vance estate smelled of cedarwood, expensive Turkish tobacco, and the dry, suffocating scent of burning paper. It was a room where destinies were not forged, but bought, sold, and liquidated like underperforming stocks. Roxanne stood rigid on the Persian rug, her spine a straight line of military precision that felt entirely alien to the decadent curved velvet furniture surrounding her. In her hand, she held the thick cream-colored envelope. The official seal of the Department of the Air Force was stamped in bold, unyielding blue wax across the back. It was an elite tactical flight enlistment directive, a ticket out of the golden cage. "You look ridiculous holding that, Roxanne," a voice drifted from the chaise lounge. Evelyn Vance didn't look up from her ledger. She was a woman carved from ice and old Southern capital, her tailored Chanel suit immaculate, her diamond rings clicking against the crystal glass of her scotch. To Evelyn, everything in the world fell into two distinct categories: assets and depreciating liabilities. For 18 years, Roxanne had been firmly logged into the latter column. "It's an immediate commission to the Tactical Strike Flight Division, Mother." Roxanne said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's a black budget track. They only take 12 candidates nationwide every 4 years. Evelyn finally raised her eyes. They were a piercing, calculated gray, the exact color of the stormy sky outside the tall estate windows. She didn't look proud. She looked thoroughly inconvenienced. "A black budget track." Evelyn mimicked, her lips curling into a sharp, dismissive sneer. "Let me translate that into terms that actually matter to this family: a 5-year contract to be a glorified government chauffeur, a measly government stipend, and a guaranteed ticket to a flag-draped coffin before you're 25. Tell me, Roxanne, how does that pay dividends to the Vance name?" "I'm not looking to pay dividends." Roxanne tightened her grip on the envelope. "I am looking to serve. I'm looking to leave." "You are looking to ruin us," Evelyn snapped, standing up with a fluid, predatory grace. She crossed the room, her high heels clicking like a countdown on the hardwood. She stopped mere inches from Roxanne, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the faint metallic tang of the rain outside. "You are a female, Roxanne. Let's not pretend you possess the intellect or the administrative ruthlessness to handle the Vance Group. Your only utility, your sole fiduciary purpose to this bloodline, was to secure the Texas oil merger. The Sterling family has been waiting for an alliance. Your marriage would have injected $40 million in liquidity into our logistics division." "I am not a financials injection," Roxanne said, her jaw clenching so hard her teeth ached. "You are whatever I say you are until you provide value," Evelyn countered coldly. She reached out her manicured fingers unexpectedly, snatching the honor insignia, a small silver propeller and wing pin Roxanne had earned during her preliminary civilian flight certifications, right off Roxanne's lapel. Before Roxanne could even gasp, Evelyn turned and tossed the silver pin directly into the roaring fireplace. The fire hissed, swallowing the metal. The silver began to blacken immediately under the intense heat of the embers. "Your sister Clarissa understands her worth," Evelyn said, not even looking at the fire. "She is currently finishing her executive MBA. She will take the chairing seat of the executive board by her 20th birthday. Every share, every property, and every cent of the Vance legacy belongs to her because she knows how to look like an asset. You are a line item expense we are cutting." Expense. Evelyn sat back down, casually picking up her pen. "Go play in your dirt, Roxanne. Go fly your little planes. But remember this when you wash out, and you will do not come crawling back to this house. You are officially stricken from the Vance roll." Roxanne looked at the fireplace. The silver pin was gone, melting into an unrecognizable lump of slag. She looked back at her mother, who hadn't even bothered to look up again. There were no tears. The tears had dried up years ago, somewhere between the cold reprimands and the realization that her mother's love had a price tag she could never afford. "I won't be coming back," Roxanne said. She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the suffocating warmth of the Vance estate behind forever. The storm outside wasn't just a weather event. It felt like a physical manifestation of Roxanne's life turning to ash. The blizzard of 2022 hit the eastern seaboard with a vengeful fury, burying the tarmac of the military transport base under 4 feet of packed, blinding white snow. Roxanne sat on a metal bench inside the drafty, unheated hangar, her fingers wrapped around a steaming canteen of bitter, burnt military coffee. She wore a standard-issue olive-drab surplus rucksack, her only inheritance from the world she left behind. Her civilian clothes had been burned on day 1 of basic training. Now she was just a serial number and a pair of combat boots that didn't quite fit her narrow feet. The jump from the luxury of a private estate to the brutal, unfeeling machinery of the Air Force tactical pipeline had been a shock to her system, but not in the way Evelyn Vance would have predicted. Roxanne didn't break. She hardened. "Vance!" A voice boomed across the concrete floor. Senior Master Sergeant Miller marched toward her, his face weathered by decades of jet fuel fumes and high-altitude winds. He stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her small frame with blatant skepticism. "You look like a stiff breeze could blow you into the intake of an F-16 Vance." Miller barked hands behind his back. "Why the hell are you here? The recruiting office is down the hall if you're looking to type up flight logs." "I'm here for the pipeline sergeant," Roxanne said, standing up and saluting. Her hand didn't shake despite the sub-zero temperature in the hangar. "The pipeline doesn't care who your daddy is, and it definitely doesn't care about your feelings," Miller scoffed, leaning in. "We've got 6 weeks of cold weather survival in the northern wilderness before you even smell a cockpit. Half the boys from Texas and Georgia are already crying for their mothers. What makes you think a little rich girl from the suburbs survives the night?" "Because I don't have a mother to cry to, sir," Roxanne said, her voice flat, devoid of any self-pity. It was just a statement of fact. Miller stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, searching for a flinch, a tremor, anything that signaled weakness. He found nothing but a cold, dark void in her eyes, the kind of look you only see in soldiers who had already lost everything before they ever put on the uniform. "We'll see," Miller grunted, turning away. "Pack your gear. Transport leaves for the drop zone in 5. The next 6 weeks were a blur of absolute, unadulterated torment. The tactical pipeline didn't just test your physical limits. It stripped away your humanity until only raw instinct remained. Roxanne ran miles through knee-deep snow with 60 pounds of gear on her back, her lungs burning with air so cold it tasted like pennies. Her skin cracked. Her fingers lost sensation, and the blisters on her feet popped and bled inside her damp socks, gluing the wool to her skin. During the pressure chamber evaluations where they simulated explosive decompression at 40,000 feet, the other trainees panicked as the air was sucked from the room, their minds slipping into hypoxia-induced delirium. Roxanne sat through it, watching her own fingernails turn blue, her heart rate steady, her eyes locked on the chamber's altimeter. She welcomed the suffocating pressure. It was still lighter than the atmospheric weight of her mother's disappointment. When the men collapsed from exhaustion during the night, navigation drills Roxanne carried their gear. She didn't do it out of altruism. She did it because every pound of extra weight she lifted was a direct insult to the woman who said she was a depreciating asset. She was building an empire out of spite, one frozen step at a time. By the winter of 2024, the world had forgotten about Roxanne Vance, which was exactly how the military wanted it. She was no longer a person. She was a ghost operating under a classified call sign within the shadows of the Arctic Circle. The briefing room at the forward operating base in the North Sea was dark, illuminated only by the harsh green glow of a satellite tactical map. The wind outside howled against the reinforced corrugated steel walls, a constant low-frequency roar that sounded like a dying beast. "We have a situation," the commander announced, tapping a red icon blinking violently on the coast of a disputed frozen strait. A Marine Force recon team was ambushed during a covert recon asset retrieval. They are pinned down on a rocky shelf surrounded by hostile militia with heavy anti-air capabilities. The weather is below minimums. No commercial or standard military transport can get through the thermal inversion. The commander looked around the room at the assembled pilots. "The risk is near 100%. The airframe we're using is an unlisted MH-47G Chinook heavy tactical variant. No markings. If you go down, you don't exist." Roxanne stood up before the commander could even ask for volunteers. "I'll take the stick, sir." 2 hours later, she was 500 feet above the black, churning waters of the northern strait, the cockpit of the massive helicopter vibrating violently as it battled 90-knot crosswinds. The windshield was caked in ice, the wipers useless against the freezing spray. "We've got a lock missile alert!" her co-pilot yelled over the intercom, his voice cracking with panic. The cockpit illuminated with a violent strobing red light. A shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile had launched from the snowy cliffs below. "Holding course." Roxanne said, her hands steady on the collective and cyclic controls. She didn't dodge. She couldn't. The heavy transport was too sluggish in this soup. Instead, she waited for the precise second of optimal trajectory. "Deploying fields, now." The flares erupted from the tail, but the missile was too close. The detonation exploded off the starboard side, the concussive wave ripping through the airframe like a sledgehammer. The right engine cowling burst into a terrifying sheet of orange flame, the instruments on the panel dying instantly as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the engine compartment.
"Engine 2 is dead. We're losing rotor RPM,"
the co-pilot screamed.
"We need to ditch."
"We don't ditch," Roxanne roared back, her muscles straining against the controls as the heavy chopper threatened to roll into the freezing sea. "We have boots on the ground." Using sheer physical strength and an intuitive understanding of aerodynamic limits that defied her training, Roxanne forced the limping, burning aircraft down through the fog, skidding violently across the jagged ice shelf right in front of the stranded Marine unit. The side doors flew open, and the wounded soldiers scrambled inside under a hail of small arms fire that pinged against the armor plating like hail. The flight back was a miracle written in aviation fuel and blood. Roxanne kept the burning helicopter airborne on a single sputtering engine crossing the freezing expanse of the sea by instrument memory alone. When she finally slammed the aircraft down onto the tarmac of the home base, the right engine was a melted lump of black steel. 3 days later, in a windowless room, a 4-star general pinned the Air Force Cross to her flight jacket. It was the nation's second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism. "This medal stays in this room, Captain Vance," the general said quietly. "Your file is being transferred to the Black Budget Registry. Officially, this mission never occurred. You were sitting in a supply office in Washington handling paperwork." Roxanne looked down at the beautiful heavy medal. "That's fine, sir. I don't need a parade." 10,000 miles away, in the sun-drenched, air-conditioned dining room of a country club in Palm Beach, Evelyn Vance adjusted her pearl necklace as she looked over the latest quarterly earnings report. Clarissa sat across from her wearing a designer suit that looked expensive but lacked any real substance. She was busy scrolling through her phone looking at influencer metrics for the Vance Group's new public relations campaign. "Mother," Clarissa said, sipping her mimosa. "Did you ever hear back from that other one, Roxanne?" Evelyn offered a thin aristocratic laugh, waving her hand dismissively to the waiter for a refill. "Please, Clarissa, let's not ruin a perfectly good brunch with ancient history. Your father's associate in D.C. ran a casual background check on her last month just to ensure she hadn't accrued any embarrassing debt that could leak into our corporate filings." "And?" Clarissa asked, mildly amused. "Exactly what I expected," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with smug satisfaction. "She's some low-level desk jockey at a logistics depot near Washington. A glorified warehouse clerk counting bolts, checking inventory manifests, and sorting carbon copies for real soldiers. She's probably earning $40,000 a year and living in a studio apartment that smells like damp carpet." Evelyn leaned back, her eyes glowing with the cruel validation of a woman who believed she was never wrong. "I told her she would wash out. She didn't have the stomach for the corporate world, so she went to a place where they tell you what to wear and when to breathe. A non-entity. A complete waste of Vance DNA." "Sucks to be her," Clarissa murmured, turning her attention back to her phone, entirely uninterested. Meanwhile, half a world away in a dark classified hangar located somewhere over the horizon, Captain Roxanne Vance pulled on her anti-G suit. She stepped up the ladder of a stealth tactical jet that didn't exist on any public registry, its matte black skin absorbing the faint hangar lights. She climbed into the cockpit, the canopy sealing shut with a heavy pressurized hiss that cut off the rest of the world. She didn't have an inheritance. She didn't have a family name, and she didn't have a place at the Vance table. But as she fired up the engines, feeling the raw, terrifying power of 90,000 pounds of thrust vibrating through her spine, Roxanne smiled into her oxygen mask. They owned the dirt. She owned the sky. And they would never even see her coming. The VIP conference room, dubbed the Aurora Sphere, hung like a suspended drop of liquid mercury 60 stories above the rain-slicked concrete of Manhattan. It was an architectural marvel of acoustic insulation and triple-paned smart glass designed specifically to filter out the ugly, chaotic reality of the lower classes. Inside, the air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees, smelling faintly of expensive orchids and the synthetic crispness of high-end air filtration. On one side of the monolithic quartzite conference table sat the holy trinity of Vance aristocracy. Evelyn Vance occupied the central high-backed leather chair, her presence as sharp and unyielding as a diamond stylus. To her left sat Julian Vance, the patriarch whose public reputation as a benevolent philanthropist masked a private life dedicated to cold, calculating asset extortion. To her right sat Clarissa, the anointed heir, her fingers lazily tracing the rim of a crystal flute filled with vintage Dom Perignon. Flanking them like a sleek predatory shark was Richard Lawson, the senior partner of Lawson & Associates, a legal firm notorious for burying corporate bodies so deep the federal government couldn't find them with a subsurface radar. The double frosted glass doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Roxanne Vance stepped into the sanctuary. She did not walk, she marched. The transition from the high-stress cockpit of a C-17 Globemaster to the suffocating luxury of the Aurora Sphere had taken less than 90 minutes, and the physical evidence of her true life was written all over her. She wore her formal Air Force service dress uniform, the deep midnight blue, wool pristine, the gold-threaded trim on her sleeves, catching the recessed LED lighting. Her chest was a tapestry of ribbons, a dense multicolored grid of operational service low-altitude tactical hours, and classified campaign badges that few in the regular military could even identify. But it was her footwear that shattered the room's curated elegance. Her combat boots were not polished to a mirror shine. They were sallow, weathered, and heavy, their rugged vibram soles caked with the dried, briny mud of a remote salt flat in Djibouti and stained with a dark, oily smudge of JP-8 aviation fuel from her pre-flight inspection. Every step she took across the plush, deep-pile Persian carpet left a faint gray ghost of a footprint. It was a silent, violent intrusion of real-world dirt into a kingdom built on clean digital ledger entries. Good God, Roxanne! Evelyn sighed, pinched the bridge of her nose with a manicured hand. Did you stop to dig a trench on your way to a legal mediation? You look like a laborer. I was flying an airframe, Mother, Roxanne said, her voice dropping into the quiet, controlled cadence of an officer on a flight deck. She did not sit. She stood at the foot of the table, her hands clasped behind her back. Flying an airframe? Clarissa scoffed, her voice dripping with high society malice. She leaned back, swirling her champagne. You mean sitting in some cramped logistics depot in Washington, checking shipping manifests for uniform belts and boots? Look at you. You've been away for years and you still smell like a mechanic's garage. Richard Lawson cleared his throat, a dry academic sound that instantly drew the room's focus. He adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles and opened a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Let us skip the familial pleasantries. We are here under an emergency financial mediation clause. Captain Vance, your family has been exceptionally generous in allowing you to retain your private government career without interference. However, macroeconomic shifts require immediate asset rebalancing. Roxanne's eyes didn't waver from Lawson's face. Rebalancing? That's a very corporate word for a shakedown, Richard. Lawson leaned forward, his hands interlocking over the mahogany table. Let's look at the reality of your situation, Captain. While the Vance Group has been navigating the volatile waters of federal defense logistics, keeping thousands of American workers employed, you have been hoarded away in Washington. You draw a premium officer's salary, receive specialized hazardous duty stipends, and maintain a high-level security clearance that frankly should be serving the commercial interests of this family. My security clearance belongs to the United States Air Force, not Vance Logistics, Roxanne stated coldly. It's the same ecosystem, Roxanne. Julian Vance barked, his first contribution to the meeting coming down like a hammer strike. He adjusted his silk tie, his face darkening with a familiar patriarchal rage. We operate the heavy transport networks that move federal assets. Your sister is currently structuring a multi-billion-dollar liquidity bridge for defense contractors. And what are you doing? You're counting screws. You're checking off serial numbers on crates of obsolete aircraft parts, hiding behind government immunity, while your sister carries the weight of this family's legacy on her shoulders. Clarissa smiled a thin, ugly line. She picked up a stack of legal documents, the deed of transfer for the Aspen Aviation Complex, a premium piece of commercial tarmac and hangar infrastructure worth $80 million that Roxanne had legally inherited through a grandfather's legacy trust. You don't need Aspen, Roxanne, Clarissa said, rising from her seat and walking toward the end of the table where Roxanne stood. What does a desk clerk need with a triple-hangar private airfield in Colorado? The weight of this world rests on those of us who manage the flow of federal defense funds like myself. The real players need that infrastructure to grease the wheels of the new transport contract. Clarissa stopped right in front of Roxanne. With a deliberate, agonizingly slow tilt of her wrist, she tipped her crystal glass. The pale, bubbling Dom Perignon poured directly over the top page of the Aspen transfer contract, soaking the legal text in expensive alcohol before splashing down onto the tips of Roxanne's mud-stained combat boots. Oops, Clarissa whispered, her eyes dancing with venomous joy. My hand slipped, but it doesn't matter, does it? You'll sign the clean copy anyway. Consider it an installment payment for the 15 years you spent eating our food, sleeping under our roof, and contributing absolutely nothing to the bottom line. Roxanne looked down at the dark, wet stain spreading across her boots. She didn't flinch. She didn't draw back her fist. She didn't even blink. Deep within her chest, her heart rate began to climb towards 70 beats per minute as her adrenaline surged. Tactical breathing, she reminded herself. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. Hold for 4. She drew the cool, orchid-scented air into her lungs. The world slowed down. The ticking of the wall clock became a distant, muffled thud. Her heart rate pulled back, locking into a flat, unyielding 60 beats per minute. A perfect combat-ready baseline. She looked up at her sister, her eyes completely vacant of fear. "You missed a spot," Roxanne said softly. Richard Lawson didn't wait for Clarissa to return to her seat. He reached into his briefcase and produced a secondary folder, slinging it across the quartzite table. It slid with a sharp zip before stopping right against Roxanne's knuckles. "If appeals to family solidarity won't move you, Captain, perhaps raw data will," Lawson said, a predatory smirk breaking across his features. "We have compiled a comprehensive ledger. Call it an itemized invoice for services rendered from the years 2006 through 2022. Roxanne flicked the folder open with one finger. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, dates, and official corporate seals. It wasn't a standard accounting ledger. It was a meticulously detailed list of every expense ever incurred during her upbringing. Line item 142, Elite Pediatric Medical Care, 2009, $14,200. Line item 389, Private Primary School Tuition Differentials, $85,000. Line item 612, Security Detail Allocation during European Travel, $32,000. Line item 884, Cost of Food, Shelter, and Seasonal Wardrobe, 2015 to 2018, $112,000. The grand total at the bottom of the final page was printed in bold red ink, $2,415,890. Every glass of water you drank, every coat you wore, every hour of tutoring you received to keep your mediocre grades acceptable was paid for by corporate distributions from Vance Logistics. Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the room like a razor blade. You want to live this independent warrior woman fantasy, fine, but you will pay your debts first. You have used our capital to build your little life in Washington. Now we are calling the loan. Julian leaned forward, his hands slamming down flat against the table, the heavy gold signet ring on his finger cracking against the stone. You are going to sign that Aspen transfer right now, Roxanne. If you don't, this packet doesn't just stay in this room. We have 3 major defense trade publications ready to run a feature on the parasite officer of the Air Force. A detailed expose on how a high-ranking logistics captain used her family's wealth to purchase her position while refusing to reimburse them for her basic upbringing. It would be a shame for your commanding officers to see what an ungrateful, unstable liability you are, Evelyn added, her eyes narrowing. We've already prepared the medical affidavits, Roxanne. We have psychologists on our corporate payroll who are more than willing to provide a historical assessment suggesting you suffered from severe emotional instability prior to your enlistment. We will destroy your security clearance before the weekend. The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. In the corporate military landscape, a loss of security clearance due to mental instability wasn't just a career ender. It was a total erasure of identity. They were offering her an ultimatum: give up her grandfather's legacy or lose the sky forever. Roxanne stood perfectly still, her hands still crossed behind her back, her breath moving in that slow, rhythmic 4-count rhythm. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. Her heart rate remained a flat line at 60. She looked at her mother. She looked at her father. She looked at her sister, who was currently smirking as she used a linen napkin to dab at the champagne on the table. They thought they were playing corporate hardball. They thought they were holding all the cards because they had a high-priced lawyer and a pile of fake invoices. They truly believed she was just a paper pusher from Washington who could be bullied into submission by the threat of a public relations scandal. They had no idea who she actually was.
"Is that everything?"
Roxanne asked. Her voice was remarkably calm, almost conversational. Richard Lawson frowned, slightly unnerved by her complete lack of an emotional reaction. "That is the current terms of the settlement. Sign the Aspen transfer and the invoice is cleared, the medical records remain sealed, and you can go back to your desk in Washington with your clearance intact." Roxanne slowly brought her hands forward from behind her back. She didn't reach for the pen Lawson had placed on the table. Instead, she reached into the high collar of her service dress uniform and pulled out a small black lanyard. Attached to it was a dual encrypted biometric thumb drive, its casing stamped with the seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and a bright red classification sticker, top secret //SCI//no foreign. She placed the drive on top of the wet champagne-soaked contract.
"What is that?"
Julian growled.
"We don't need your government files, Roxanne."
"You should look closer, Father," Roxanne said, leaning over the table just enough to bring her face into the light.
"You see, you're entirely correct about one thing. I do work in logistics allocation. But you missed the department code on my assignment profile."
She tapped the drive.
"I don't count screws for regular supply lines. I oversee the logistics compliance audits for black budget operational procurement. That means every private transport contractor wishing to bid on federal defense contracts has to pass through my office's financial screening matrix."
The room went dead silent. The smirk on Clarissa's face began to falter. For the past 18 months, Vance Logistics has been bidding on the new North Atlantic Transport Corridor contract. Roxanne continued, her voice cold and methodical, like a machine reading out a system failure log. "To qualify, your corporate group had to submit verified financial statements proving your liquidity and asset distribution. Do you know what my team found when we cross-referenced your submissions with the DIA database?" She looked directly at her mother. "We found that the Vance Group has been inflating its asset valuation by exactly $80 million, the projected value of the Aspen Aviation Complex. An asset you didn't legally own but flagged as corporate collateral anyway to secure an emergency credit line from a Texas oil syndicate." Richard Lawson's face drained of color. He stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor.
"This mediation is over. Captain Vance, you are in flagrant violation of—" "Sit down, Richard,"
Roxanne barked. The sheer authority in her voice, the voice of a pilot who had commanded burning aircraft through anti-aircraft fire, slammed into the lawyer like a physical blow. He sat back down, his mouth open but silent.
"You brought federal delegates to this building today to witness my humiliation."
Roxanne said, a slow, dangerous smile finally touching her lips. "But those aren't your delegates outside the door, Mother. Those are compliance officers from the Defense Contract Audit Agency and federal marshals from the Department of Justice." She leaned in, her eyes locking onto Evelyn's frozen gaze. "You wanted to talk about invoices? This folder you gave me is an admission of corporate fraud. You've itemized personal expenses and attempted to extort a serving military officer using falsified corporate ledgers to cover a shortfall in your federal bidding compliance documents. That's a felony. Actually, it's 3 separate felonies." The pneumatic doors behind Roxanne slid open once more. This time it wasn't a waiter with fresh champagne. 2 men in dark suits with gold federal badges pinned to their lapels stepped into the room, accompanied by a pair of Air Force Security Forces airmen in full tactical gear. "Evelyn Vance, Julian Vance, and Clarissa Vance." The lead federal agent announced, pulling a set of documents from his coat.
You are under corporate asset freeze pending a formal investigation into defense procurement fraud and attempted extortion of federal personnel.
Clarissa dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the quartzite table, the remaining liquid pooling around her designer skirt.
Mother, do something. She's lying. She's just a clerk.
Evelyn didn't move. She couldn't. For the first time in her life, she looked at her eldest daughter and didn't see an asset or a liability. She saw a predator. Roxanne picked up her thumb drive, wiping a drop of spilled champagne off the encrypted casing before slipping it back into her pocket. She looked down at the family that had discarded her like trash in a winter storm 2 years ago. The weight of the world doesn't belong to the people who move capital, Clarissa, Roxanne said softly, adjusting her service cap as she turned toward the exit. It belongs to the people who keep it from falling. Enjoy the audit. She marched out of the Aurora sphere, her heavy, mud-stained boots leaving a permanent trail of defiance on the pristine carpet behind her. The atmosphere inside the Federal Adjudication Chamber of the Department of Defense Procurement Oversight Division did not resemble a standard courtroom. It was a sterile, soundproof amphitheater lined with brushed steel and acoustic obsidian panels. Here there were no spectators, no cameras, and no dramatic gallery gasps. The fate of billions of dollars in military contracts and the freedom of corporate titans were decided in absolute classified silence. At the elevated center podium sat Federal Judge Harold Bennett. A veteran of both the military judiciary and supreme federal litigation, Bennett was a man whose face seemed permanently cast in iron. For 40 years, he had watched the greediest corners of the American military-industrial complex try to bleed the government dry. He was entirely immune to corporate theatrics. To his left, Evelyn Julian and Clarissa Vance sat trapped behind a secured defense table flanked by federal marshals. Richard Lawson stood beside them, his forehead glistening with a fine sheen of cold sweat, his legal briefcases laying open like disemboweled beasts. Across the aisle, Roxanne Vance sat alone. She didn't have a team of silver-tongued corporate lawyers. She only had a singular, severe-looking military advocate in an Army service uniform and a heavy matte black secure terminal sitting between them. We are here to review the emergency injunction regarding the asset freeze of Vance Global Avionics. Judge Bennett announced, his voice a gravelly baritone that echoed off the obsidian walls. He didn't look at the Vance family. He didn't look at Roxanne. His focus was entirely on a thick lead-lined document portfolio that had just been delivered by a high-security courier. The portfolio was stamped with a double band of infrared security tape and bore the highest operational classification marker available to the federal government, Mark 10//classified compliance / protocol 14D OCX.
Your Honor,
Richard Lawson stammered, stepping forward, his voice cracking slightly.
My clients maintain that the asset freeze is a gross abuse of power orchestrated by a low-level logistics officer using personal vendettas to subvert an essential national defense supply chain. The Vance Group is vital to the— Quiet, Mr. Lawson, Judge Bennett cut him off without looking up. With a specialized cryptographic keycard, Bennett broke the infrared seal on the portfolio. He opened the file labeled 14DOCX. For the first few seconds, Bennett's expression remained indifferent, the practiced mask of a seasoned judge. But as his eyes scanned the primary stencils, the unique deep purple digital security watermarks that only existed within the black budget command structure, his hands froze. His eyes widened. The iron mask shattered. Bennett looked down at the supreme electronic signature embedded at the bottom of the first 5 directives. It wasn't the signature of a warehouse clerk. It was an apex-level Department of Defense authorization code backed by an operational tier so high it technically bypassed congressional oversight during active warfare. The judge's gaze slowly drifted away from the paperwork. He looked across the courtroom, his eyes locking onto Roxanne Vance. The indifference was gone, replaced by a profound, raw shock that bordered on absolute reverence. Slowly, deliberately, the 64-year-old federal judge stood up from his bench. He didn't call for order. He didn't address the attorneys. Instead, he stepped out from behind the high mahogany podium. He stood at absolute attention, his spine snapping straight with the flawless precision of an old soldier, and raised his right hand to his brow, executing a perfect, unwavering military salute directly toward Roxanne. The courtroom froze. The air itself seemed to solidify. Evelyn Vance's mouth fell open in a silent, horrified gasp. Clarissa gripped the edge of the table so hard her manicured nails clicked violently against the wood. A federal judge, a man who answered only to the Constitution, was saluting their discarded, worthless daughter. Roxanne remained seated for a beat, then smoothly rose to her feet. She returned the salute with a single crisp movement. "At ease, Judge Bennett," Roxanne said softly. Bennett lowered his hand, his voice thick with an emotion he could barely contain. "The court recognizes the presence of supreme authority. God help me. I didn't know it was you." "Your Honor!" Evelyn Vance shouted, her aristocratic composure completely evaporating as she slammed her palms onto the defense table. "What is the meaning of this? This is an administrative hearing for a rogue employee. Why are you showing deference to a girl who counts bolts in a warehouse?" Judge Bennett returned to his seat, but the coldness in his eyes when he looked at Evelyn was lethal. "Silence, Mrs. Vance. If you speak out of turn again, I will have the marshals remove you to a holding cell beneath this facility. You have no understanding of the room you are currently standing in." He turned his eyes back to the 14 DOCX file. "Mr. Lawson, you claim your clients are the victims of financial extortion by a parasite relative. Let us look at what file 14 DOCX actually records." Roxanne's military advocate, Major Vance Avery, stepped forward and tapped a command on the secure terminal. The massive projector screens on the obsidian walls flickered to life, illuminating the dark room with rows of cold, unyielding financial transaction ledgers. "Let the record reflect the verified financial audit of the Black Budget Tactical Allowance Fund under the direct authority of the operational commander," Major Avery announced. The screen zoomed into a ledger dated December 2021. In the winter of 2021, Major Avery stated, his voice echoing with a flat, rhythmic weight, Vance Logistics was facing a quiet, fatal liquidation. The Internal Revenue Service had prepared a public seizure warrant for the primary Vance estate and 40% of its domestic operating liquidities due to a $50,000 tax fraud discrepancy engineered by the Chief Financial Officer, Evelyn Vance. Evelyn went entirely pale, her hands trembling against her Chanel suit. The public execution of that warrant would have destroyed the family's credit rating and disqualified them from federal bidding permanently, Avery continued. The warrant was never executed. Why? Because an anonymous wire transfer of exactly $50,000 arrived 48 hours before the seizure. That money did not come from a corporate bank. It came from a hazardous duty battlefield stipend earned by Captain Roxanne Vance during a low-altitude deployment in a hostile theater. She bled in a cockpit so her mother wouldn't have her mansion taken on the nightly news. That's a fabrication, Julian Vance stammered, his voice losing its booming patriarchal authority, becoming thin and hollow. "We never asked for her money. You didn't have to," Roxanne said from her seat, her voice cutting through his denial like dry winter grass catching fire.
You were too busy looking at your own spreadsheets to notice the wolf at the door. I didn't do it for you, Father. I did it because the Vance name was attached to my uniform, and I refused to let your financial sloppiness compromise my operational status." Major Avery tapped the console again. The screen shifted to 2023.
In July of 2023,
Avery read aloud, Clarissa Vance was investigated by the Ohio Department of Commerce for a commercial fraud discrepancy involving the illegal diversion of state-subsidized logistics infrastructure. The fine to settle the civil liability without a criminal indictment was $300,000. The money was paid within 12 hours from a military honor trust fund, a fund established for specialized tactical flight personnel who waive their right to public disability claims. Roxanne looked directly at her sister. Clarissa shrank back into her chair, the malicious smirk she had worn in the Aurora sphere entirely gone, replaced by the terrified, frantic expression of a child caught stealing. "You called me an expense, Clarissa," Roxanne said, her tone devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was the tone of a judge reading a foreclosure notice. "You drank $60,000 champagne while I was paying off your fraud penalties with the skin off my knuckles. Every luxury you used to mock me was bought with the blood you thought I was wasting." The silence in the amphitheater was so heavy that the hum of the cooling fans inside the secure terminal sounded like a jet engine. Richard Lawson looked at the screens, then at the 14 DOCX file, and slowly closed his portfolio. He was a corporate shark, but he knew when he was swimming in waters filled with naval mines. He quietly stepped 3 feet away from the Vance family, signaling a silent professional abandonment.
"But that is old history,"
Judge Bennett said, his voice dropping into a register that made Julian Vance's heart skip a beat.
"Let us look at why File 14 DOCX was actually opened this morning. Let us look at the current contract proposal for Vance Global Avionics."
The screen shifted one final time. The elegant blue and gold corporate branding of the Vance Group appeared on the left, but it was immediately overlaid with a massive crimson digital stamp, treason directive / security breach / D CIS investigation CR-992. Clarissa Vance, Judge Bennett read from the file, as the newly appointed executive chair of Vance Global Avionics. You submitted a collateral guarantee using the Aspen Aviation Complex to secure a $12 billion federal contract for the supply of high-grade titanium alloy drone wings for the next-generation unmanned aerial fleet. Is that correct? Yes, Clarissa whispered, her voice barely audible. It's a standard procurement bid. It would have saved our logistics division.
"The alloy sheets you sourced,"
Judge Bennett continued, his hand tightening on the edge of the paper until the leather of his glove creaked,
"were certified through a secondary supplier in Panama, but according to the Defense Criminal Investigative Service forensic lab results detailed in Section 4 of this document, those alloy wings are not aerospace-grade titanium."
The screen displayed a molecular breakdown graph. The lines were jagged, unstable, flashing in warning yellows and reds.
"They are a low-grade porous aluminum nickel composite, manufactured in a sanctioned facility in East Asia,"
Bennett said, his voice rising with a terrible, righteous fury.
"They are designed to look identical to titanium under a standard visual inspection, but they suffer from catastrophic structural fatigue when exposed to atmospheric friction above 400 knots. If those wings had been integrated into the active drone fleet, 24 tactical reconnaissance units would have dropped out of the sky over the Pacific within their first 40 hours of operation."
Julian Vance slumped forward, his head in his hands.
"We didn't know. The supplier guaranteed the specifications.
We were just trying to lower the production overhead to meet the federal cost cap. You were cutting corners on the blood of American soldiers to protect your profit margin for the Texas merger," Roxanne said. She stood up, walking slowly toward the center of the room. Her sallow, oil-stained combat boots sounded like thunder against the metal floor panels.
You thought you were operating in the shadows of the free market.
Roxanne continued looking down at her mother, who was now staring at her with wide, uncomprehending horror.
You thought that by taking Aspen, you could hide the asset inflation and use the federal advance capital to buy real titanium before anyone noticed the dummy shipments. You thought you were the ones running the Matrix.
Roxanne, please. Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking the cold Southern aristocrat, finally cracking down to the bone.
We are your family. We are your blood. We can fix this. We can restructure the board. You can have Clarissa's seat. You can have the presidency.
You still don't get it, Mother, Roxanne said, stopping right before them.
You never did. You can't offer me a seat at a table that I have already broken.
Judge Bennett turned to the final page of File 14-DOCX.
The digital watermark there wasn't a standard stamp. It was an active, rotating biometric cipher that required a live confirmation. The authority required to issue a total non-appealable network lockout permanent contract debarment and corporate asset liquidation under a national security treason directive is reserved exclusively for the commander of the Black Budget Procurement Oversight Command, Judge Bennett announced. He looked at Roxanne, his expression a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. Captain Roxanne Vance,
Bennett said.
Or should I address you by your supreme operational registry? Major Avery stepped to the console and executed a final keystroke. The low-level logistics captain's profile on the screen dissolved. The old civilian records from the Vance estate vanished into a black hole of digital erasure. In their place appeared a full-dress military intelligence file. The image showed Roxanne, her face stern, her chest bearing not just ribbons but the stars of a general officer's staff.
Let the record show, Major Avery declared, that the individual known as Captain Roxanne Vance is a deep-cover tactical alias used for field-level asset validation. Her true rank held under the Black Budget Defense Appropriations Act of 2024 is Lieutenant General Roxanne Vance, Director of the Special Operations Aviation Command. Evelyn let out a choked, desperate sound, her hands clutching her throat as if she couldn't get enough air. Clarissa began to weep openly, her head dropping onto the table, her designer suit soaking in her own tears. Julian just stared at the floor, his spirit completely crushed under the weight of the stars on his daughter's true file. General Vance, Judge Bennett said, his voice softening into something deeply personal. Before I execute your directive to seal this chamber and permanently terminate Vance Global Avionics, I must say something on the record. Roxanne looked up at the bench. Go ahead, Judge. My son, Captain Marcus Bennett, was the commander of the Marine Force recon team on that ice shelf in the Northern Strait in 2024. Bennett said, a single tear slipping past his iron exterior. He told me about the burning helicopter. He told me about the pilot who defied the storm, who took a missile to the airframe and refused to leave until every single one of his men was inside. He told me he never got to see her face because her mask was on and her file was locked under a black budget. The old judge stood up once more, his hand trembling slightly as he looked at Roxanne. Thank you for my son's life, General. Roxanne offered a small human nod, the only warmth she had shown since entering the room. He's a good soldier, Judge. He was worth the engine. She turned her back on her family one last time. She didn't look at her mother's pale, pleading face. She didn't look at her father's broken shoulders. She didn't look at her sister's ruin. Execute the directive, Judge Bennett, Roxanne said as she walked toward the heavy steel exit doors.
Lock down their networks. Freeze the assets. Wipe the Vance name off every federal ledger in this country. With a firm, decisive stroke, Judge Bennett brought his electronic gavel down against the pad. Across the United States, every server belonging to Vance Global Avionics went black instantly. Every bank account was locked with a red federal seal. Every building was flagged for immediate asset forfeiture. The kingdom of ice and old capital was liquidated in a single millisecond. Roxanne stepped out into the humid, rain-slicked air of the city, the heavy doors sealing shut behind her with the sound of a closing tomb. She looked up at the gray sky, the distant rumble of a military transport jet cutting through the clouds above. The ashes had settled. The sky was clear, and she was finally free. The heavy electronic thud of Judge Bennett's gavel landing on the cryptographic pad didn't just signal the death of an empire. It sounded like the detonation of a kinetic warhead within the pristine walls of the amphitheater. Richard Lawson, a man whose entire 25-year career had been built on smelling a legal ambush before the first shot was fired, felt the room's air pressure drop. His eyes darted from the red treason directive flashing on the overhead obsidian screens to the 4 stars of a general officer's staff, now blazing on the true, unredacted military profile of Lieutenant General Roxanne Vance. Joint Special Operations Command, his mind screamed. She isn't a logistics clerk. She is the shadow hand that moves the entire black budget fleet. Lawson's hands began to shake a violent, uncontrollable tremor that he tried to mask by sweeping his documents into his alligator skin briefcase. He didn't just stand up. He practically threw himself away from the Vance defense table. He knew the federal statutes down to the punctuation marks. Defending a corporate client in a contract dispute was lucrative. Being dragged into a Joint Special Operations Command investigation for manufacturing fraudulent evidence against a sitting 4-star general was a one-way ticket to a maximum security federal penitentiary.
Mr. Lawson.
Evelyn Vance's voice was high, sharp, and laced with an uncharacteristic note of panic as she reached out to grab the sleeve of his tailored suit.
What are you doing?
Stand up and object. This is a kangaroo court. She is using fabricated military intelligence to—
Do not touch me, Mrs. Vance!
Lawson hissed violently, jerking his arm away from her manicured fingers, as if her touch were radioactive. He didn't look at her. He couldn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the floor, avoiding the piercing Arctic blue gaze of the woman standing at the center of the courtroom.
Your Honor,
Lawson stammered, turning toward Judge Bennett while completely backing away from his clients.
Let the record reflect that Lawson and Associates was entirely unaware of the fraudulent sub-supplier documents submitted by Vance Global Avionics regarding the drone fleet components. We were provided with falsified corporate ledgers by the Chief Financial Officer and Executive Chair. In light of these egregious, undisclosed national security violations, my firm is withdrawing representation effective immediately.
Lawson!
Julian Vance roared, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple as his large frame bolted upright from his chair. We paid you a 7-figure retainer. You don't walk out on us. I am protecting my license, Julian, and my freedom,
Lawson whispered, his voice cracking. He snapped the latches of his briefcase shut with 2 sharp metallic clicks. He didn't wait for Judge Bennett to grant him permission to leave. He didn't look back at the broken dynasty he was leaving behind. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted toward the rear exit, his leather shoes squeaking in a frantic, desperate rhythm against the polished steel floor panels until the heavy pneumatic doors swallowed him whole. The Vance family sat entirely alone behind the defense table. The high-priced armor of corporate legal defense had dissolved in less than 60 seconds, leaving them completely naked before the unyielding machinery of military justice. The space left by Lawson's flight didn't remain empty for long. The rear doors of the amphitheater slid open again with a heavy mechanical hum. 4 special agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service,
DCIS wearing tactical vests over their dark suits, their service badges gleaming under the stark LED lights, marched into the courtroom. They were flanked by a fire team of Air Force Security Forces airmen in full combat gear, their rifles held at a disciplined, low-ready position. The lead DCIS agent, a stone-faced woman with her hair pulled into a tight, severe bun, carried a stack of red-bordered federal arrest warrants. She marched straight toward the Vance table, ignoring Julian's towering stance and Evelyn's icy glare.
"Clarissa Vance,"
the agent announced, her voice echoing off the obsidian walls with the finality of a eulogy.
"Under the authority of the Department of Defense and the United States District Court, you are under arrest for first-degree national defense procurement fraud conspiracy to commit treason and the deliberate sabotage of national security fleet assets."
No, this is a mistake, Clarissa shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical, glass-shattering pitch. She backed away from the table, her high heels catching on the legs of her chair, causing her to lose her balance. She collapsed heavily onto the cold, brushed steel floor panels, her designer skirt tearing along the seam, her immaculate blonde hair falling wildly across her face. Mother, don't let them touch me. Make her stop it.
"Roxanne, tell them you're lying."
As an agent stepped forward and grabbed Clarissa's wrist, pulling her up from the floor, Julian Vance completely lost his composure. The decades of absolute power he had wielded over his corporate fiefdom blinded him to the reality of the weapons in the room.
"Get your hands off my daughter!"
Julian bellowed, lunging across the table, his heavy arms swinging out to strike the DCIS agent. He never made contact. Before his fist could clear the edge of the mahogany, 2 Air Force Security Forces airmen moved with explosive, lethal efficiency. One airman seized Julian's extended arm, twisting it behind his back with a brutal, bone-snapping pivot, while the second airman drove his knee directly into Julian's midsection. The air left Julian's lungs in a loud, wet gasp as the massive patriarch was slammed face-first onto the quartzite table. A heavy black combat boot was driven into the small of his back, pinning him to the stone, while a set of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his thick wrists.
"Julian!"
Evelyn screamed, her voice completely stripped of its aristocratic lacquer. She stood frozen at the center of the chaos, her hands clutched against her chest, her pale gray eyes moving from her husband pinned to the table to her youngest daughter, whose small wrists were currently being locked inside a pair of cold, unyielding iron cuffs. Click, click, click. The sound of the handcuffs locking into place on Clarissa's wrists seemed to echo directly in Evelyn's chest. She looked across the aisle at Roxanne. Roxanne hadn't moved an inch. She stood like a statue of midnight blue wool and gold braid, her face an unreadable mask of absolute terrifying calm. The daughter they had despised, the one they had called a line item expense, a glorified warehouse clerk, and a parasite sitting in a dark corner of Washington, was the center of gravity around which the entire room was turning. She wasn't just observing their destruction, she was the architect who had drawn the blueprints. The reality of her total, irreversible ruin finally broke through the final layers of Evelyn Vance's vanity. The Vance group was gone. The bank accounts were frozen. Her husband was pinned under a soldier's boot, and her favorite child was being dragged toward a federal transport van in chains. With a low, desperate sob that sounded like dry paper tearing, Evelyn collapsed to her knees. She didn't care about the stains the floor might leave on her expensive Chanel suit. She didn't care about the federal marshals watching. She crawled across the floor, her diamond ring scraping against the metal panels, until she reached the heavy, mud-stained tips of Roxanne's combat boots.
"Roxanne,
please." Evelyn wept her tears, smearing the heavy makeup on her wrinkled cheeks, her manicured fingers trembling as she tried to reach up and grasp the hem of her daughter's uniform trousers. "I beg of you. Use your power. Call them off."
You have the stars. You have the intelligence clearance. You can tell them it was an administrative misunderstanding. You can call the Pentagon and save Clarissa. She can't survive in a prison, Roxanne. She is your little sister. Please have mercy on your own blood." Roxanne looked down at the woman who had once thrown her silver flight pin into the burning coals of the estate fireplace without a single trace of remorse. She didn't draw her boots back, nor did she lean down to comfort her. Her eyes remained as cold and unyielding as the Arctic ice shelf she had flown over during the black budget missions of her youth. Slowly, deliberately, Roxanne reached up and adjusted the stiff formal brim of her Air Force service cap, centering the gold-embroidered eagle and anchor insignia over her eyes. "I don't negotiate with corporate parasites and suit-wearing traitors, Mother," Roxanne said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a weight that silenced the remaining cries in the room. "For 18 years you looked at me and saw nothing but a depreciating liability. You itemized my childhood down to the last dollar, tracking the cost of the food I ate and the roof over my head as if I were a thief in your house. You told me my only utility was to be sold off to an oil syndicate to balance your corporate ledgers." She leaned down just enough so that her words were intended for Evelyn's ears alone. "You were wrong about the ledger, Evelyn. I was never your expense. I was the only asset this family ever had that couldn't be bought. And now, the bill for your arrogance is due. Let's see how your capital handles the interest." Roxanne straightened her spine, turning her back on her mother's weeping form with a fluid military pivot. As she turned toward the heavy steel exit doors, a tall man in a dark, simple civilian jacket stepped out from the shadows near the security detail. It was Daniel, her husband. A city firefighter whose hands were calloused from real axes and wet hoses, a man who had stood silently at her back through every storm, never asking for her family's wealth, and never flinching from her secret military rank. He didn't say a word. He just extended his hand, his fingers closing securely around hers, providing the only real warmth she had ever known. "Let's go home, General," Daniel said softly. Roxanne smiled beneath the shadow of her cap. "Let's." They walked out together, the heavy steel doors of the adjudication chamber sliding shut behind them, sealing the Vance dynasty into the dark archive of federal liquidation. 3 years later, the afternoon sun streamed through the massive glass pavilion of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. illuminating the polished aluminum hulls of legendary aircraft suspended from the ceiling like a fleet of metallic angels. The air was filled with the low, pleasant murmur of tourists, the laughter of children, and the faint scent of roasted coffee from the museum cafe. Roxanne walked slowly down the central gallery. She wasn't wearing her midnight blue service dress or her 4-star general's insignia. She wore a simple, elegant ivory trench coat, dark trousers, and low leather flats. Her face was bright relaxed, the deep lines of stress that had once defined her jaw during the black budget years completely smoothed away by 36 months of absolute unburdened freedom. Clutched tightly in her right hand was the small warm palm of a 4-year-old girl. The child's name was Lily. She had Clarissa's pale blue eyes and bright blonde curls, but none of the cold malice that had destroyed her mother. After the federal trials had concluded with Clarissa sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security facility, and the Vance Group completely dismantled by the asset forfeiture liquidation, Clarissa's high society husband had quietly vanished, abandoning the infant child to the state foster system to protect his own remaining assets. Roxanne hadn't hesitated. The day the adoption papers cleared, she had taken Lily into her home, erasing the final remnants of the Vance cycle of abuse with a quiet, unconditional love. "Look, Auntie Roxy!" Lily squealed, pointing her small finger upward toward a massive matte black reconnaissance aircraft suspended directly above them. That one looks like a giant bird. Roxanne stopped looking up at the sleek, aggressive lines of the retired stealth airframe. That's a very special plane, Lily. It flies so high that the people on the ground can't see it, and it flies so fast that the storms can never catch it. Did you ever fly one? Lily asked, her eyes wide with childhood wonder. Roxanne leaned down, lifting the little girl into her arms with an effortless, practiced strength. She tapped the child's small nose with her finger, her heart filling with a deep, pristine sense of peace that no corporate ledger or military promotion could ever provide. "A long time ago, sweetheart," Roxanne whispered, looking past the steel wings of the museum display toward the clear, bright blue sky visible through the glass ceiling above. "But now I'm done flying in the dark." She set Lily back down onto the polished marble floor. The little girl laughed, turning to run toward the next display, her small shoes clicking in a bright, happy rhythm that held no echo of the past. Roxanne followed close behind her. Her hand slipped into Daniel's pocket as he walked beside her, her spirit entirely clean, entirely victorious, and finally completely free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.